Hi, Dr. Dan here. What I want to talk about today and go through in a tutorial is how to use, what is and how to use Node.js. So the first thing you're going to want to do is go ahead and download Node.js, and let's read a little bit about it. So on their webpage they say it's a synchronous event-driven JavaScript runtime. This is built in the Chrome V8 engine, and what it basically allows us to do is a number of things. For one, we can, in a couple lines of code, create our own server, and that's what we see happening right here. The other thing it allows us to do is we can access many APIs. So APIs, application programming interfaces, that are basically libraries where we can access remote code that someone else has developed to do lots of things, right? So there's a lot of other things that Node.js is useful for. It's very useful as a package manager, so downloading packages or modules of code that again are just compressed code. It's all JavaScript, but it makes our lives easier when we want to do complex things running on a server, so outside of the browser. JavaScript just runs inside the browser usually. With Node.js we can run it on our server itself and do some scripting there. So I'm going to assume you've downloaded it. For this, I had in mind a project. It's kind of a dark time in our world right now. The novel COVID virus is decimating our culture and our society, and so for this project I want to show how Node works, how we can set up a remote server running a Node application, and how that Node application can provide us some useful information. So what we're going to do in general is we're going to set up a COVID info server. To do that, we want to install Node.js. We're going to initialize a project and install dependencies locally. We're going to set up a server locally and create client-side views for a user to interact with. We're going to call a COVID information API to and for me, I keep looking up, I live in Idaho, and I keep looking up my state statistics for the number of cases and the number of deaths. So information for specific states, cases and deaths. And obviously there's a lot more information you could pull and display, but I want to keep this kind of simple. So finally, we're going to move that local server to a remote AWS EC2 and run it. Alright, so that's the plan. I thought this would be an interesting project given the times, and I've never really done a tutorial specifically on Node and its capabilities, although I've done tutorials on frameworks using Node, such as Angular and Ionic. React also built in Node. So a lot of advanced web frameworks are built on top of Node. Alright, so we'll get started. I'll assume you've downloaded Node and install it with the default settings. Once you've done that, you can open up, I'll let you see what I'm doing here. You can open up a Node.js command prompt. That'll come with the install. and mine will probably look a little bit different than yours, but you should have the same basic commands. So what I'll do is I'm going to cd to change directory to documents, and I'm going to make a directory. So just to, in case you're not super comfortable with command line stuff, I'll show you what I'm doing over here in my directory. So this is my documents directory. Let's make a directory called COVID info. That's going to be the name of our app. Okay, so now you can see that directory, it's just a normal directory, has come into being somewhere. Where I saw it. Okay, let's just refresh this. There we go. COVID info, and there's nothing in it, right? So it's just an empty directory. So now I'm going to start doing some Node stuff. I want to do npm, which is our Node package manager, and I want to init a project. Let's just run npm init, and it's going to ask me, let me pull this over a bit so you can see. It's going to ask me for the name of the package, and I'll call this, ooh, you know what? Let's quit this. I meant, actually, before I did that, to cd into this directory that I made called COVID info. Alright, so now I'm inside the directory here. And now I can do an npm init. And it's going to say, what do you want your package name to be? COVID info by default, which is fine. Version, fine. Description, information about COVID state. Entry point index.js is fine. We'll leave test command and git repository blank, but notice that you can specify those and hook this up to a git repository. Probably that'd be a good idea. I'm going to leave keywords blank and put my name for author. And leave the license fine. Alright, so all we have so far is a package.json. And so now what I want to do is install a few things that I will also need. But before I do that, I want to just open this up with code, so we have a nice view of what's going on. So let me bring this down here. So we have a package manager with that information that I just put in. I'm going to go ahead and create a file called server.js. This is going to be our main file for interacting here. All right, so we're going to need a few things here. What we're going to use now is npm install. So Node Package Manager install allows us to go and grab remote libraries and APIs and frameworks that have a lot of compressed code, and it's going to install those into something called Node modules, as you'll see. So first thing we're going to install is Express -- save. Express is frequently used with Node, and what it allows us to do is more easily set up the port that we're going to be listening on, set up our server, handle things that the user might do, like make a GET request of our server, make a POST request of our server, and it handles routing. So routing is going to allow us to interact with the UI that the client sees, use variables in that UI to dynamically render code from our server. Okay, so now if we take a look, we've actually got some node modules here. There's quite a few. What these node modules are, you can think of them as like little pieces of code, right? So if we look in Express, we have a library, and we have a whole bunch of little chunks of code that allow us to use that code as we need it. And to do that, what we want to do is just declare up here, we're going to have a constant variable. We'll call it express. So just plain JavaScript so far. Constant meaning we're not going to change the value of this variable once we set it, and we're going to require express. So that is going to import the things we can do from the Express node modules into this server. So now we can use all that code. For example, we can say we're going to make a variable called app, and we're just going to initialize express. From app then, we can do app.use, and we can use various things. We can also do app.listen and specify a port. So let's use port 3000. So I'm pretty sure that port's not being used. And then we'll have a anonymous function, and what we'll do is we'll just console.log that we are listening on port 3000. Okay, so that's just going to tell us that our server is on and it's awaiting clients to interact with it. All right. We're also going to use a few things here. So we're going to use a template engine. And what that is, this template engine is called EJS, and the template engine is just going to allow us to easily interact with HTML from variables to our server, where we mess with those variables with code. So just like, normally we'd use like jQuery and Ajax to dynamically render code, but it'd take a lot to get that working. We can just use a server template where when some part of that template changes, our Express and Node server just handles those changes and makes them happen dynamically. So we're gonna let's see, npm install again, and this time we're going to install EJS, and that is our template engine. Okay, so since we have EJS now, we can do let's see, we can do an app.set a view engine and tell it that it's going to be EJS. Notice that I haven't used any semicolons here. Okay, not yet anyway. We're also going to use something called the body parser library, and that's just going to help us interact with those variables in our view engine. So let's go ahead and install that, and let me clear this so we can see. Npm install. Let's see. This is going to be, yeah, it is just body parser. Body parser -- save. And the last thing we're going to use is a API. I'll let you take a look at this real quick. Called Novel COVID API. see, where is it? Here we go. So here's the GitHub repo. You can actually pull all this code and take a look at it. Oops, that's not it. The one we're going to use is this one. So it's just a REST API that's going to, it doesn't require any authentication, so we don't need an API key. We're going to get JSON formatted responses back, and it's going to allow us to track this. And what we can do is actually take a look at a Node SDK. So this is the one that we'll actually be calling, and here is the source code. So you can install this, you can actually look at how they're scraping for information, and you can take a look at how to log some things. You can get all the data for all countries, or you could just use the US and get data for a specific state. That's what this particular project's going to do. All right, so that's where that code's located. I'll link to that in the description of this tutorial too. So again, npm install, and this time it'll just be novel COVID -- save. All right, and what we'll do is we'll do constant COVID equals require novel COVID. Okay. So let's see, we have our, we need also a constant body parser equals, again, the body parser is going to allow us to have access to key value pairs. So when we have a user enter things like the city they're interested in COVID info for, we can grab that city from the view and then post it back using Express. This is just going to allow us to parse things conveniently. So require body parser. And let's just keep this a little more neat. We'll app set the view engine. What we'll do also is app.use, and we'll just let it know we're going to be using body parser. URL encoded, and it doesn't really matter, that you understand exactly what I'm doing with the body parser, except that it's just going to allow me to access variables through key value pairs. Okay. So this is most of our setup here. We're going to need a couple more things here. First of all, I'm going to make a new folder, and I'm going to call this views. Now, by default, our view engine is going to look for this folder, and it's going to look inside this folder for a file called index of type EJS. Okay? Now, index.ejs is basically normal HTML, except, as you'll see in a second, let's have a head title, except we'll have some variables, virus info, and let's have a link. We'll probably want a style sheet here, So same thing you would normally see in HTML. Style sheet. Text.css. And we'll have to make this, but basically it'll be in a folder called CSS, style.css. Okay. We might as well make it fancy with some fonts. So I'm just going to put a link in for this that I'm just pasting right from Google Fonts. This is going to allow us to access the Open Sans font of Google APIs. Standard stuff here. We might want a meta for charset too. Meta charset UTF-8. So remember we specify that. We specify that over in our in our server, where when we're URL encoding. Okay, so that's it for that. Now for the body, we'll have a div div class equals container, and in that div we'll have a field set. So this is just going to hold our form, and that form will have an action, and we're going to direct it to the root, and the method will be post. And so this is how, when a user clicks our button, we flash over to our server and have to handle a post call. Okay? It's important to keep in mind all this will be dynamically rendered, meaning that it'll come into existence as the user navigates to our page and change as the user interacts with it. Alright, in our form we'll have two inputs. The first one will have input name, give state. This is where they'll enter their state. Type, it's going to be text. Let's give it a class that we can specify the format in our CSS. We'll call it state input. And let's make a placeholder. Enter a state. And let's make that required too, so that if they don't enter a state, we don't have to deal with that error. We'll just tell them to enter a state. The other input is just going to be a submit button. Let's call this class info button. And let's make the value get coded info for state. Like that. Alright, and that's all for our input. Now, here's where it gets a little interesting. So, inside our field set, but below our form, we're going to have 3 p elements. And the first one, inside of the p element, if we use these percent brackets, there's whatever they are, we can enter code inside of them. So we have a percent equals. In our case, we're only going to use the code for variables. So we'll put our state there. And this is a variable now that we can, and we could even put code in here, like if state equals null or something like that, and it will work, right? It'll interpret that as code because of EJS's ability with Node and Express to dynamically pass variables back and forth to the server file in our case, but it could pass it back and forth anywhere. All right, in this one, we'll put cases and defs. Maybe we should make defs and cases a certain class. So that we can perhaps color them. So class equals cases. Defs. All right, and again, we're going to insert some code here. And we'll put our variable, we'll call cases here, and we'll call this variable defs. Like that. All right, and we end our field set, we end our div, we end our body. So now we have to make some CSS for this because we are calling it. Now, Express by default won't let us or any user interact with the with anything except for this EJS that gets rendered, unless we tell it to. So what we'll need to do is make a new folder first of all. So a new folder, and we'll call this public. And then inside this folder we can place a CSS folder, and inside that we can have a new file called style. Oh my goodness, style.css. Okay. Now, so again, the reason for that is that by default we won't be able to access anything. We'll get these CORS errors for security reasons. You might want to conceal a lot of things that are running on your server in Node. We're not going to be using an API key because we don't need one for this particular API. Authentication isn't required, but normally we would probably have an API key, and we wouldn't want other people to have that information. So everything's kind of locked down, but we can tell our server that we want to app.use. Let's see, we're going to use Express static. Again, another nice use for Express, and we're telling Express that the things in the public folder are okay to access for this app. And in order to have access to the CSS, we need this to happen. All right, let's take a look at that CSS file now. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to have body be styled with, I don't know, 750, margin 0 auto, and then we'll specify our font family. We'll say font family. We have access to open sans from the Google API, and if that doesn't work, we'll fall back to sans serif. All right, for the container we made, remember that div container, we'll specify a width of 600 pixels. We will do 0 auto margin. And then for our field set, let's do display. Let's make it a block. Border 0px, and we can do maybe 20 pixels of padding. Then we have our state input, which is a p element, but it has a class. Again, let's do display block. Let's give it some font weight. of 300, which we can do again from that. With that particular font, it's going to look good. 100%. We'll expand to the maximum of our parent class here. We'll do font size and set that to 24 pixels. So our, ooh, we already did width. Let's make sure we don't have a border. And let's do box sizing. Border box. This is all just to make it look like a little bit professional. Color can be, let's do an RGB. And let's see here. Maybe like, I'm just going to put some default values in for a second so I can pick. This is a nice, yeah, that's actually kind of what I wanted. I wanted a gray. So, that's fine. Didn't expect that to work. Okay, so we got a kind of gray color. What I was going to do is just pick the spectrum here. We can set it like that. Cool thing about Visual Code and a lot of IDEs is we can pick colors that way. We don't have to actually go look up what each color is. Let's make the background white. Let's see, what else can we do? Font. Family can be open sans, comma, Dana, but if that as a fallback. Padding 10 pixels. Margin, let's do 30 pixels and 0 pixels there. Alright, that leaves our buttons. So dot info button. Whoops. Let's see, we want background color can just be transparent. The border we can make about 2 pixels solid, and let's make that gray. Padding, do 10 pixels. The width could be full size, 100%. And actually for padding, let's do 10 and 30. And let's set a min width at like 350. Okay, and I'm not guessing at this. I've kind of looked at it before and seen how these look. But these are all just things you could adjust on your own too. And then, let's see, that's the info button. We could do an info button hover and just give that like a different color. We could make the border 2 pixels solid and make it like green or something so that you know you're hovering over it. And we can even make the background color to be, I don't know, turquoise. Alright, so you know you're hovering over it. Let's do cases and just set the color to yellow, and depths, we'll set the color to be red, of course. Alright, Okay, so now back to our server. We now have things to interact with and some CSS styling. So the server code is actually going to be relatively quick. Let's see, are we using novel code? We are. We're using body parser. Just making sure we're using everything we need to use here. I think that's good. Okay, so we're going to listen on port 3000. We'll need to call our API asynchronously. So what we'll need is an async function, and we'll call this getStats, and we'll take a parameter called state input. So we're going to pass in a state, and if you take a look at the API for this particular if you take a look at the example for this particular API, you can see they're using an async function. You have to actually wait for a second to get the data that you want. And that's important information, right? Because that means that we want to wait until we get data back to dynamically render this new information. So what I'll do is I'll write an async function and then call it. So we'll have a variable called state that we're going to return, and just following their example, we want to await. Remember, COVID is our constant variable up there, and it has a function called getState. And what we'll pass into getState, and here's where EJS starts coming in, we're going to pass in the state input. Where are we going to get that state input from? From our EJS template when the user types in a state. And then we're just going to return state. All right, so that's our async function. Now remember, app is our express app that we've made that's listening on port 3000. So the first thing we need to write is our get function. This is how we're going to render the everything, right? So get with this backslash means we're going to go to the root and render right to the index. And to render to the index, we're going to do a function that takes two parameters, rec and response. And all we're going to do here is open that up, and we're going to do res.render, and we have three variables in our index, right? So we're going to render our index, and it's going to look in views for that index we just wrote. But there are three variables in there. So the variables are state, and we're just going to pass an empty string in. Cases, we'll pass an empty string. Hey Rocky, you sleeping over there? My dog's dreaming. And deaths. Okay. And that's it. That's all we need to do to render that whole app template. And when the user interacts, we need to do an app.post. And again, we're going to post, we're going to route it right to our root. And now we're actually going to use this this function, these function parameters. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to let state equal. So this is a new variable. Let state equal rec.body.state. Okay, so here, the reason we can use rec.body.state is that we're using this body parser. It's the only thing that allows us to access the state variable that is inside of this rendered view over here, right? So once we have that, we have whatever state they've entered. We can get our stats, but remember, this is an async function. We can pass in the state. And to wait until it gets done, we do .then, and it's going to pass us back a response. Okay, so when we get that response, and that's our return value right here, then we can say we're going to, again, rest.render. We're going to render our dynamic view, we're going to render it to index, and we're going to pass in the same variables, but now, instead of an empty string, we'll pass in response dot cases. Oh, actually, we're going to pass in state, right? Cases is going to be response dot cases. So when we get a response back from this and we have it in state, we have some things we can ask it. We can ask for how many cases there have been, how many deaths there have been with the dot, because we'll get these JavaScript objects. So we can use dot syntax. Whoops. And we have one final variable, which is deaths, is going to be response.deaths. Okay. I've been developing this app for like a day, and I've seen the cases and deaths just like triple. It's a little depressing, honestly. Not great, but you know, I figure like this is something I was looking up, and I thought, you know, this would be a nice thing to show how you can just use a little bit of web knowledge to write an API that tells you some useful information, you know. All right. Again, we're not using semicolons in the get and post methods. Internally, we are using them. So here and here. Okay. So notice all that happens in the then response. That's important. And that's it. We are ready to try this out. And so in order to run this, we're going to now do node server.js. You can see it's listening on port 3000, so far so good. And so now in our browser, we can go to localhost 3000. All right, and you can see we have cases and deaths. It's styled appropriately, and we can enter a state. Let's try New York. I haven't tried that one yet. Let's get info. All right, cases and deaths, not great. I can enter my state, Idaho, and you see that it is updating. All right, so great. We have an app that tells us the info that we wanted. However, it's only running on our local desktop now. Suppose we wanted this available on our, somewhere on the actual web. So danielandpekian.com. Suppose we wanted it available on port 3000 of danielandpekian.com. Well, my homepage actually runs on a AWS server, an EC2 server. And if you want to learn more about EC2, you can read about it on AWS or look at some of my other tutorials where I talk about that. But as you can see, I have an EC2 server running, and that is where my website actually resides. So I also have a domain pointed at that public IP. And that's why I can go there with danielandpekian.com. This is an HTTPS encrypted domain, as you can see, and the routing we've done is actually only for HTTP. I have a redirect. If you type in HTTP, it still will go to HTTPS. But it's important to note that while we're testing this, because we haven't built in any HTTPS encryption, I'll have to go to the HTTP version of my website. Okay, so all that's great. In order to get to my website, first of all, let's hit Control-C to kill this process. All this is great. We can close this now. We can also close this now. Let's open up MOBA Xterm. And I will connect to my server. And what I'm going to do is just pull that information onto my server. So let's go here. Alright, so I'm now on my server in AWS. Let me click follow terminal, and I'm going to cd to my var HTML directory. Alright, and I'm just going to drag this folder over into here. Let's give that a second to copy. There it goes. Probably a more efficient way of doing this would be to copy it to my server first. And let me just, while that's happening, go up and show the process for installing Node. So there is a command. There we go. And I'll let you just take a look at that command, but basically we want to curl, and what we're going to do is install nvm through an install script. NVM is what we want in order to be running Node on our server. And once you have NVM, you can check your version. You can install the latest version of Node. So I used NVM to install Node like that. And then I used npm once I had Node-g to globally install n, and then I typed n latest to make sure I had the latest Node. And this is on an Amazon Linux AMI EC2. The commands might be slightly different. But basically you want to install Node, right, somehow onto your server, and depending on what type of server you have, it'll be a little different. So once again, that process, and I'll link to some resources for this in my tutorial. Let me see if I can pull that up for you right now. I don't have it. Let's just Google installing Node on there we go. So the first thing that pops up, there's that curl response right there. You just want to copy and paste that. Once you have NVM, you want to activate it with this command. Once you have NVM, you want to install Node, and then you can check your version. Let's see. Let me go back. There's a better one. Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's going to be a little different for each Amazon Linux. There we go. Is this it? There we go. So again, it's that curl command, and then you get that source line, and then you can run nvm version. Once you have nvm, Node version manager, right? You can install Node, and that will get you running with Node.js. Okay, once you have Node, you can start npm things. You can npm things like n, right? Which was so npm install -g means globally, and n is just a shortcut for always making sure you have the latest nodes. All right, so now I'm going to cd to my weather, cd to weather server, and I'm going to hit control. I'm just going to hit bg real quick. Dash bg. How do I look at my processes? Not process, PS. Yes. Let's just see what we've got running. PS -eaf. There we go. The reason I'm doing this is I believe I already have a Node server running in the background here, and that's going to be pause this while I find the process. So I see it. It is actually called Node server right there, and there's our PID. So I'm going to kill it. Kill 13450, and let's list our processes again and make sure that that's not still running. 1.3 is gone. Excellent. Okay. So that, by the way, is how you would kill a background process once you started one. All right. Now we need to. So let's run our server here. Let me cd back into clear. Where am I right now? Okay. Yeah, let's cd back into. What did I call it? COVID info. Alright, and let's just run this. So node server dot js. And now if we go to http danielandpeking.com/COVID info port 3000. Oh, we might not need that backslash there. We should get to this node, and this may actually have to be at our home directory. So let's try that. Ah, there it is. Okay. Well, that's interesting. So I didn't know that, but if you go to your server instance, it's your server instance itself that's listening on port 3000. That's where things are going to get rendered to. So I guess it doesn't actually matter where the server's running from. In fact, you could be in a lifted directory that's protected, right? So I could restrict public access to the node server directory itself, but still render it to here. All right, so let's test it out. It's still working. Cool. Now the problem is if I exit, oh, one last thing too. This is why I went to AWS. What you'll need to do with EC2s is, because I'm using a port that is different from port 180 or port 80 and port 443 for the two normal web traffic ports, I have to open up my security groups. I have to open up that particular port. So if you scroll down here and view my inbound rules, let's just launch a wizard, security wizard. Okay, so if you take a look here at the inbound rules, you'll see that I've made a custom TCP rule. To do that, you just edit and you just add a rule, right? So add rule, custom TCP, port, the port that you want, and you want to set it to everything, okay? My outbound rules are also have those two ports opened up. So you want to make sure that you have those ports opened, or by default EC2s are pretty locked down, so you won't be able to see that port. That's kind of an important step. Alright, so we've got it working, but if we exit out here, what's going to happen, so as soon as I leave or I shut my computer down, that's kind of interesting. I didn't think it would, oh, I have not actually left. Alright, so let's try another one. Alright, so now we're spinning because the process, the node process, exited as soon as we exited that shell. So to leave this on our server, what we'll want to do, and I'm almost done, we're running a little bit long. What we'll want to do here is reconnect to the server. Okay, so having trouble pulling that down. Alright, I reconnected to my server, cd back to that directory, and we're going to run this again, so node server.js. I'm going to hit Control C. No. Control Z. There we go. And you'll see that we've, so Control Z and we stopped, but it gave us a number to track that process. Okay? So in order to run this process in the background, we are just going to look this up. I always forget this. To run this process in the background. We want to, is it just BG? BG and then the variable 1. So BG %1. It's the percent that always throws me off. Alright, and so now that is running. So now we should be able to exit, completely log off this, and we've still got our server running. So there we go. Okay, that is all I wanted to accomplish today. We showed how to install Node. We talked about what Node is and what it allows us to do in terms of package manager, routing, using a server that runs code off browser, all that kind of stuff. We set up and tested all our code locally, made sure it all worked, and then we put our code onto a remote EC2, and now we have that. Okay, so that's a lot of stuff. It's what an API is, how to use an API using Node, how to set up a Node application. A lot of things we didn't talk about, which I will in later tutorials and have in other tutorials, is that Node is the basis for a lot of very popular web frameworks. The two most ones that come to mind are Angular and React. A lot of web pages now are Angular and React SPAs, so single page applications, where just like you saw, we have like one page and we dynamically load into that page and change it using different view engines, using different libraries. Instead of having multiple pages, we just have one app that renders them all. It's a very fast, very efficient way to do web development, very safe and secure as well. You absolutely have to know Node and how to use it in order to successfully navigate the worlds of Angular and React, and by implication, Ionic and React Native. And Ionic and React Native are the two most commonly used, I'll go out on a limb, most commonly used and very popular frameworks for developing mobile applications. Electron is the same kind of thing, but for desktop applications. So mobile applications on your phone, tablet, whatever, Electron on your desktop, those are developed using web languages. So JavaScript, HTML, template engines, TypeScript, which is a superset of JavaScript, all of those are built on top of Node. So it's very important to know what it is, how it's used, what you can do with it. I hope this project is useful to you and you see how powerful Node is. There are millions of APIs that you can call and get information from and use once you have a good command of how to use Node. And I hope you've seen how Node can interact with a AWS server as well. All right, thank you very much for watching. I will see you next time. No, you'll see me next time? Okay.